Here's a story I learned at school. So imagine incredibly high mountains, enveloped with marshmallow clouds and drowning in luscious greenery. They shield a small valley, dotted with farmer fields and pastures. For thousands of years it has been a home for hard-working, proud and resistant people who would live in harmony with local nature. Now let's zoom into this white young guy, chained and forced to look after cattle. Just months ago, his life was full of opulent balls in the most luxurious settings. He left everything behind to become an imperial officer because this guy was bored and hungry for fame and taming new frontiers. But now, he's a slave and a war prisoner. He's miserable, desperate, and basically wallowing day and night. The focus of the entire story is his internal dialogue, cursing his bad luck and ruminating about his old soul trapped in a young body. Despite being a prisoner, of course, he remains super hot, and a local woman cannot resist by instantly falling in love with him. She risks everything and arranges his escape. For those of you familiar with Romantic European literature of the 19th century, this would sound like any other glorifying tale about a white European colonizer of those times. But this is The Prisoner of the Caucasus, the most celebrated poem by the most famous Russian poet Alexander Pushkin. Everything in it centered on the hardships of the prisoner, despite that the prisoner came to commit one of the worst genocides in European history. The prisoner who was not a mere victim of circumstance, but a willing agent of Russian colonial expansion into indigenous Circassian territory. Pushkin paints the Circassians as noble savages and children of nature, but in reality they were a fiercely independent nation that resisted brutal colonization, which turned into a horror fest of terror and systematic extermination. Russians murdered and deported up to 97% of all Circassians in the late 19th century, or 1.5 million people in barely a decade. So when 130 years later, the same land hosted the Sochi Winter Olympics, nobody had any idea that this land wasn't Russian, and the word Circassian would not ring a bell. Hi there, I'm Maksym Eristavi, a Ukrainian journalist and author of the award-winning Russian Colonialism 101 guidebook. In it, I trace a serial behavior pattern that Russians used through dozens of invasions to justify them: gaslight, invade, exterminate. Committing the worst crimes with blind innocence, pictured in The Prisoner of the Caucasus, is not random. It's a centuries-old culture that allows various Russian regimes to avoid accountability for colonial violence. This is Matryoshka of Lies, the Imperial Innocence episode. Not only through state propaganda, but also in arts and literature, Russian society has been cultivating the image of messianic victims for centuries. Even today, both Putin and the Russian opposition echo each other in claiming that Russia never attacked anyone with evil intent, and that there is integral goodness to Russian imperial benevolence, and that Russia's expansionist wars have always been defensive.
One of my students noticed that in many of the texts that we read, and she pointed out that, this idea, like we had to deport these people because we were afraid of them. And a lot of academics reproduce this Russian narrative, how Russia felt insecure, that's why they had to attack. She said that this is a classical abuser rhetoric. When a man attacks a woman because he says that she annoyed me or something like that. So the idea that Russia is afraid, that's why it has to be a preventive attack, it's exactly the expression of Russian imperial innocence.
For this episode, we called back Dr. Botakoz Kassymbekova, a prominent Qazaq thinker and the central voice in the quest to explain Russian imperialism and colonialism.
And violence and abuse are two different phenomena. They are very interrelated, but abuse is not only because violence can take place between equals, but abuse, you first of all need to victimize somebody, and it's a structural violence, it's narrative, it lives not only in kind of physical expression, but also in your head and in the culture and in the words that you use.
When the horror of genocide in Ukraine unfolded in 2022, Dr. Kassymbekova mobilized decades of her research and personal intimate knowledge of Russian colonial violence to conceptualize this term she calls Imperial Innocence. It is a shortcut to understanding why Russia keeps invading its neighbors over and over again.
And still people reproduce it, and they reproduce this Russian imperial innocence by these verbs like fear. The verb fear is exactly the verb of Russian imperial innocence. So a lot of the propaganda, a lot of that story penetrates into our imagination through these verbs, these words. You know, there is no such thing as potential threat, as well as it's not a potential threat. You know, there is no reason to look at it as a potential threat. But at the same time, for example, the narrative that is very widespread among the kind of liberal, oppositional, but also Putin is something that, like, the whole Russian society is united, is to say that if, for example, republics of Tatarstan or Bashkortostan become independent, there will be a lot of violence, there will be a lot of war, there is a lot of blood. So actually, you know, it's again portraying these people who are under occupation as dangerous, and it's again the kind of imperial innocence. I mean, imperial innocence works in so many ways.
When I first came around the work of Dr. Kassymbekova, it helped me a lot to connect the dots between seemingly random and illogical acts of Russian colonial violence. Her imperial innocence theory worked as a glue that linked everything up into a coherent ideology behind Russian invasions and genocides. I asked her to guide us through examples of how it works in practice. This is the sound of the July 8th bombing of Kiev committed by Russia in 2024. That day, Moscow spent over $230 million on dozens of missiles to bomb irrelevant for their military successes objects such as a kid's cancer hospital, a maternity ward, or an apartment building. As of early 2024, Russia's bill for genocide in Ukraine surpassed $250 billion. Considering overall limited success, this is a huge undertaking for the country where a third of the population still has no indoor toilets. While Russian ruling elites live off super profits from the war industry and vast natural resources they steal from colonized indigenous lands, you need to explain the rest of why they must keep sacrificing comfort for endless wars.
Also full of symbolism. So the fear is that this could trigger a very strong Russian response. We saw yesterday that a residential area of the city of Zaporizhia, a major city in the south of the country, very close to the front lines, was hit. More than a dozen.
Okay, Hugo Bashega there, our correspondent in Kyiv, obviously.
So glorifying Russianness as a messianic suffering for the good of a better, more civilized world is a propaganda sweet spot that has been maximized by the most popular Russian leaders, from Pyotr I to Stalin to Putin. And also by Russian wannabe leaders like late Alexei Navalny, who refused to call genocide in Ukraine anything but with deflective words like Putin's war. His followers still occasionally suggest that both sides might share responsibility for the invasion.
The Russian story functions only when a Russian person is a victim and a sufferer. That's kind of the cultural code, which is an imperial, but also a national, but it's mostly an imperial code. So if you want to become a politician in Russia, you want to be a populist, and you want to become a popular person, the formula that you need to use is to portray evil enemies, and we are the poor Russians who are, for example, they steal money from us, there is corruption, Or, if we don't take, for example, Crimea, then we will not have our heart, because Crimea is our heart. We're always victims. So if you know kind of how historically that imperial narrative, that national story has developed, and you understand that society, you'll be extremely politically successful if you follow that story, because that is already something that is so integrated into the culture. This is something with what you grow through films, through books, by reading Pushkin and Tolstoy, Lermontov. This is the classical literature is based on that story. It is coded in the story that we are the suffering nation, we are the victims.
Coming back to my school days, do you know why I'm so well versed in the Russian literature and used to speak Russian much better than my native Ukrainian language? In my neighborhood in southern Ukraine, out of 4 schools, there were 3 Russian language schools. And it was already during the Ukrainian independence in the 1990s. Every time the Ukrainian government even tried to strengthen education in native Ukrainian language, it would face bullying and aggressive threats from the former metropole. Professor Kassymbekova reminds us that these kinds of stories you can hear from all Russian neighbors. It's another practical manifestation of Imperial Innocence, when generation after generation of Russians find it impossible to live side by side with neighbors who are unapologetically authentic selves. Feeling threatened by other cultures or languages, Russians often perceive themselves as victims when they are not the dominant force. If you don't speak Russian, you discriminate against me. If you don't speak your language, it's because Russian is more important, goes the prevailing sentiment.
Here I can give an example of a wonderful study conducted by Professor Anna Whittington. She wrote an article where she analyzed the letters in late 1980s that Russian Soviet settlers who lived in Central Asia wrote to Gorbachev. She analyzed many letters, and what she noticed is that some of the Russian people, they wrote that if, for example, a Kazakh speaks Kazakh in front of me, I feel cultural degradation, or I feel discriminated. And it is very often that, for example, there will be a group of, for example, Uzbeks, and there will be one Russian person. If they speak Uzbek, then the Russian person feels discriminated in Uzbekistan. This is kind of this cultural hierarchy, is that this colonial attitude that the Russian language is something that civilizes. So if you speak Russian language, you are civilized. If you don't speak, you're not civilized. And there is this fear of loss of this status, of this higher status. And you have to defend this status, your own status in that society as a settler, simply by accusing the others in aggression.
Albeit the Imperial Innocent concept is a perfect fit for explaining ingrained culture of colonial domination in Russia, it's not entirely unique just to Moscow. In her work, Professor Kassymbekova often builds comparative bridges to other authoritarian and fascist movements worldwide.
I can imagine that a superpower that presents itself as a victim for aggression, it's also something that right-wing movements, usually the rhetoric that right-wing movements in nations use. For example, they say, all these immigrants, they come to destroy us. We need to defend ourselves. That's why we will, expel or kill them. And kind of the imagination of being a permanent victim is something that feeds the illiberal agenda very often.
Oftentimes, when I discuss in public how Russian colonialism works, it starts feeling like a psychoanalysis session. So why does it matter to dig so deep into psyche of a colonizer? I end my Russian Colonialism 101 guidebook with a reminder that partitioned, disarmed, and decolonized Russia is the only peace plan that will work, emphasizing that we are not facing just one madman or one regime, but an entrenched culture of abuse. Ukraine's victory will help with the first two, but decolonization means freedom of indigenous nations that the Russian Empire still occupies. Dr. Kassymbekova warns that it also means self-work for anyone who identifies with being Russian as an imperial identity.
decolonization means empowerment, and decolonization means actually nurturing self-respect, nurturing agency, nurturing understanding that one shouldn't be ashamed of oneself because one was taught to be ashamed of oneself. Actually, decolonization means coming out of this position of victimized, but it also brings this identity of achievers. That we are achievers, and once you achieve that, when you decolonize yourself, when you achieve your own voice, when you kind of feel more comfortable with yourself, this is the path that a lot of Russians will have to go. But the precondition for that kind of decolonization of kind of from the imperial status is to understand that, equality, because equality is seen something as very, very dangerous. Like the biggest fear for Russia to become a country like Czech Republic, a country like Poland, a country like Hungary, a country like Ukraine, to become a small, normal country equal to others. So equality is a threat. It's good for you to be small, but we cannot be a small country. We have to be the big country. But it is actually not only imagination of this, we need to have this huge territory, but we need to dominate. If I don't dominate it, if I'm not the most important in the room, if my voice is not the loudest in the room, if I don't hold the monopoly on power in the room, if I don't dictate others how they should understand this or that, then I feel a victim immediately. So equality is a perennial threat.
Have you seen how many Russians support genocide in Ukraine these days? Even independent pollsters say it's above 75%. For many in the empire, losing this privileged status is unbelievable, even if it means they are no longer part of an oppressive machine, a machine that has colonized hundreds of nations and made their country the largest on the planet. But at the end of the day, it just sucks to lose privilege. This empire has been standing for so long that it's sometimes hard to imagine it can be no more one day. Professor Kassymbekova still doesn't lose hope that Russians themselves might bring that end closer. They need to start with stopping being silent.
I'm thinking for a long time, my dream is that from Russian scholars, Russian citizens, activists, I've been raised in a Russian culture. So the only reason I understand it so well, I went to a Russian colonial school. I've been in mostly kind of Russian environment. My grandmother grew up in a Russian orphanage after her family died in famine. My mother grew up in a very Russified environment. In many ways, we felt more Russian than Qazaq. But with the full-scale invasion, I feel that what I miss is that I don't see people of kind of who associate or who identify themselves as Russian joining us in our struggle for decolonization. I feel that a lot of people, one of the ways to physically experience imperial innocence is silence, and to say, it's nothing about me, it's Putin, it's all others. I will just, sit through silently through this war, and then just people will forget and will return to the status quo. And that also is an expression of Russian imperial innocence, because I think you can overcome this innocence by joining us. And this is what I was dreaming of since 2022, and it's something that didn't really happen yet. I wonder how many years will pass when we will have the departure from innocence to activists, to people who actually say, okay, let's end this innocence, let's educate people, let's change the narrative, let's do something about it, let's get into the dialogue. And I think this kind of being silent, just disappearing, is also an expression of Russian imperial innocence.
This show is written by Yev Kopiika, produced by Alina Poliakova, mixed and sound directed by Anastasiia Fedoskina, co-produced and narrated by me, Maksym Eristavi. This show is free thanks to so many people around the world who support the legacy Ukrainian journalism of Ukrainska Pravda. You can join their ranks. Find out how at pravda.com.ua. If you like this show, please spare a minute to rate, comment, and share it. The Ukrainian production team creates every new episode against all odds amid bombings and blackouts, so this show has to trend, and you can make it happen. The empire will fall.